All right, so we're at our final week of new material in this phonetics class. As usual, this video will review last week, preview this week's material, and note the important dates coming up. So last week we kicked off the perception arc with the physiology and psychophysics of hearing, and we also had a quiz, which is now marked. So this chapter in the textbook follows a somewhat odd structure. It starts off with a sequence that's kind of like that of chapter 10, breaking down the perceptual properties rather than acoustics by sound class, from vowels through approximants, fricatives, and so on. Along the way, though, we see some other concepts that play into the perception of multiple categories of speech sounds kind of sprinkled in. So vowel undershoot is one. That's pretty vowel specific, of course, but equivalence classification isn't. This is the process of recognizing the same sound from multiple instances that differ from each other in various ways. Right? Remember, we had the issue of a lack of invariance that we discussed in the acoustics chapter, chapter 10. And this kind of comes back to us in this chapter. Then we get into normalization, which is a necessary part of any theory of speech perception. And there's various types of normalization we look at. We look at intrinsic and extrinsic normalization, point normalization, and range normalization. And these are all introduced in the context of vowels, but they're, I hope, not too difficult to start connecting to other classes of sounds as well. When we get to the consonants, we learn about the idea of category boundaries. That's places where a continually varying parameter abruptly shifts the percept to a different type of sound. In the discussion of fricatives, we learn about cross-splicing, which is an experimental method used to help determine, among other things, the relative importance of different auditory cues for a sound's identity. And if you remember, burst frequency was presented as a useful cue to plosive identity back in chapter 10, but here we learn in the section on plosives in chapter 13 that the picture is complicated. The exact information that the burst conveys depends, sometimes a lot, on what vowel follows the burst. There are various important specific facts to take away from this discussion, so do read carefully through the textbook as usual. But one overarching message is simply that it is complicated. I remember hearing an analogy in my first or second year of phonetics that my 20 years of experience since then has only reinforced, really. And that was that studying the individual acoustic and auditory properties of the speech signal in order to reconstruct the message being received, it's kind of like smashing some painted eggs and then studying the fragments as a way to try and reconstruct the original designs on them. Messy. Anyway, the next section of the textbook moves on to some bigger picture theoretical perspectives. We start with motor theory. That's the idea that our perception of speech is achieved by simulating, as we hear the signal, how we would move our articulators to make the same sounds. This perspective has been fruitful enough that it's even generated some sort of sub-theories based on the exact units of perception, whether they're the actual gestures, the intended gestures, or something similar. And there's been some suggestive neurological support for this approach in the discovery of mirror neurons. Okay, so after that we get a look into the experimental evidence for categorical perception in identification tasks and discrimination tasks. One important thing to note here is that speech units tend to be perceived categorically, even when the perceptual features that distinguish them are on a continuum, such as formant transition time or formant frequency, that kind of thing. We get another experimental method here. That's the high amplitude sucking paradigm, which has enabled researchers in various fields of linguistics and even psychology more generally to investigate the perceptual abilities even of really young pre-verbal infants. And we find some evidence of categorical perception even there. Researchers also work to check these results against analogous non-speech stimuli, in part to answer the question of whether the patterns we see in speech are due to perceptual mechanism particular to speech or to a general mechanism that's used for all perception. Reaching even deeper, we see researchers asking if these patterns that we observe in humans, infants to adults, part of the motivation for this is a general interest in how humans and other animals work and comparing them. And another part, which isn't addressed in the textbook, is the ongoing project to map out how and when humans might have evolved that set of capacities, perceptual, articulatory, and cognitive capacities that add up to an ability to use language as we know it. Okay, and then the closing section of this chapter looks at perception and the acquisition of a new language. We explore concepts in cross-language speech perception, plasticity, and some evidence bearing on the critical period hypothesis. In other words, do you get to a point where it's too late to learn a new language, in this case the sound patterns of a new language? Two models of perception in second language learning are discussed, the perceptual assimilation model and the speech learning model. And we do find there's evidence that although younger children have the best outcomes for learning a second language, even adults like me can, in the right circumstances, learn the phonetic patterns of a second language. So that's a nice point to end this this course on, at least for me anyway. Okay, so coming up, this week is when the third and final transcription assignment is due. That's Tuesday, the day after I'm posting this video, April 6th. That's also the day of our tutorial, and that tutorial will focus on speech perception. Next week we can look forward to the final quiz and a tutorial to wind things up. The third and final lab assignment is due on April 20th, the week after that, so I expect next week's tutorial is going to focus on that work. Of course, at any tutorial, the tutorials are for me to help support you and answer questions that you have, so you can bring any questions to any tutorial as usual. And yeah, with this week's material now covered, you should be able to embark on whichever of the three options you favor for that last lab assignment. There's the anatomy and physiology one, a sort of auditory version of the Frankentract that we had for lab 1. There's a new Sounds of the World's Languages assignment that's much like the first one, except it incorporates some of the new sounds, especially the suprasegmental stuff that we covered a couple of weeks ago. And there's a perceptual experiment that you can run. As always, I'm happy to answer any questions or have a discussion about what's before us by email, on the eClass forum, or in the tutorial. So just let me know.